Okay, hi. Hi, everybody. Hello. How's it going? This is just a really quick test to see how my microphone sounds. I think we did a quick test the other day, and I think things sound pretty good, but just checking to make sure that all the audio sounds okay. We're going to get started here in I know that it's just after 3 o'clock. We're going to get started here in just a couple minutes. I just want to make sure that there's enough time for folks to kind of trickle in, and just to make sure that we're not rushing anything too much. Cool. Sounds good. Thanks for the confirm on that. Awesome. Cool. So yeah, just sit tight. We'll get started in just a couple minutes, just to give people a second to come to download anything that they need to download. And again, the link there on the screen, the bit.ly Unlearn Unity, that's a link to a Google Drive that has some slides that I'll be presenting today. This gdscript script that we'll be using, and also some objects, some 3D objects that we'll be using, generously provided by Kini. Shout outs to Kini, for folks that don't know. Kini.nl is an awesome resource. Post that in the chat. So yeah, for anybody that doesn't know about them, definitely check that out. But this is just a little selection of some 3D objects from that. So yeah, please make sure to go to the URL and to download the player.gdscript and the demo obj.zip file. And yeah, you can check out that Godot versus Unity presentation as well. That's loaded there, but I'll be going through that over the course of today. Yeah, welcome everybody. Oh yeah, totally. Thanks for posting my stuff. I'll do a brief introduction of myself, with some links there for people to check out what my what I'm about. But yeah, thanks so much, Lee, for posting those. I really appreciate it. Okay, cool. So we've got some people kind of trickled in here. I think yeah, it's like 5 past. I think I'm gonna get started. There's still a little bit of leeway for folks kind of coming in, so even if we have a couple of folks just kind of joining us a couple minutes late, that should be okay. We won't get too far behind. So I'm going to switch gears and get things started. So again, thanks everybody for joining me. Thanks to Babycastles for hosting this. Really excited to do this workshop and demo with y'all. Should be really fun. I'm gonna be keeping it kind of light and pretty low key. Again, I'm gonna be trying to check the chat as much as I can, so feel free to post any questions or anything that I get to in there. and hopefully I'll get to it as quickly as I can. But let's go ahead and get started. So I'm going to switch the screen here, and I'm going to go ahead and click present. I got my little deck here. So yeah, this is Unlearn Unity, a beginner's guide to learning Godot. I'm Nicholas O'Brien. It's really great to be here. I guess my kind of professional studio name is SA Games. You can check out my games at sagames.itch.io. And then that's my Twitter handle too, just in case you want to give me a follow over there. And it was posted before in the chat, but if you want to check out other projects of mine that are games related and other non-games related projects, you can also go to double_.net, spelled out. Yeah, I have some other stuff over there too, if you want to check that out. So cool. So a little bit about me, or a little bit about my background just before we get started. Like I felt like doing this presentation like justified me maybe like giving some context about like who I am and what I'm making, and why maybe I'm a good person to lead this workshop. So I'm a game developer and artist based in Brooklyn. I'm coming to you from my home studio right now. And I've been working in games and 3D animation and kind of critical game studies for about a decade. And I've made kind of 3 or 4 major projects that have all been built actually in Unity. And that was kind of my entry point into learning game design and game development practices and strategies. And I'll talk a little bit about why I made the switch in just a second. But a lot of my work kind of focuses on what I call essay games, these games that follow in a kind of essayist tradition, thinking about labor or technology, thinking about kind of the history of this kind of false narrative progress that we often attribute to technology, thinking about infrastructure, thinking about the ways in which like private institutions or private corporations influence or end up taking over public institutions. So a lot of my work is kind of invested in thinking about how to be critical of those technologies, but also to be reflective of those things. So not just kind of like finger wagging, but really trying to really think deeply about like what happened in particular moments in either American or kind of Western history where like technology kind of jumped the gun or maybe like took over some private interests, and thinking about like how that's relevant to where we are right now. Some of those things might be more salient than others, but yeah, so if you're interested in checking out more of my work, absolutely, be in touch, let me know. There's ways that I just posted of being able to get in touch with me. And I guess like a really quick plug for a project, my most recent project is this project called The Last Survey, which is about global mining reserves suddenly depleting. It's kind of like a speculative fiction visual novel that's all hand-drawn. That was released on Nintendo Switch not too long ago. Again, that project is called The Last Survey, so if you want to check out something really recent that I've worked on, that would be great. I would love for you to check that out. Cool. So I think that's all for now for about me. If you have other questions about that stuff, feel free to ask. But yeah, maybe more importantly is like answering this question of like why I'm kind of making the switch from Unity to Godot. I have a bunch of personal reasons or a bunch of like different reasons for doing this. But really a lot of this can be like grounded in this feeling of that I was using this like really overbloated software. When I first started using Unity, it was Unity 5. This was like a long time ago. And it felt like really still lightweight, nimble. It felt like really kind of like fun and exciting. And a lot of development was happening in it. A lot of people were starting to get into it. The community of independent makers and artists that were using it were, really excited about how it was making a lot of the work that they wanted to make, a lot easier to make. It just seemed like that it was like a good moment to kind of be in that community of makers and really thinking about that. But over the years, they kind of have like added and absorbed and kind of added more and more things onto it. And currently I just find it like a really bloated piece of software. It's, for me, when I use it on my PC, like it takes a long time to compile, it takes a long time to load, it takes a long time to import things. It's just, I find it to be like just really, really unwieldy as a piece of software. And it includes a lot of things in its kind of core bundle that are like not really relevant to me as a game maker anymore. And that's like both frustrating to me and has become like a little bit of a burden, right? Like I kind of didn't get into game design or game development to like learn how to write like HSL code and stuff like that and shader code, or understand how to like work with a render pipeline and stuff like that. Like that's not really why I got into it, though that stuff can be really interesting for some folks and sometimes interesting for me. I felt like I started getting really bogged down in that kind of stuff and started losing sight of the types of stories and narratives and ways of interacting with, you know, media that drew me to the software, or drew me to game development in the first place. So that's one big reason. Another big reason is like, you know, recently I'm sure that a lot of people have been reading about this, or some folks have been maybe seeing this like pop up in their timelines. Like I just really can't get behind like Unity's roadmap, or like Unity as a corporation anymore, whether it be like its kind of Pentagon or DoD contracts, or the way that the CEO behaves. You know, there's just a lot of things that like I just really feel like I can't believe in the software anymore, and I you know, using it just has felt like, for me personally, and I don't mean to cast disparaging comments on anybody that uses it, but for me, I just like really couldn't bring myself to like, you know, support this thing anymore, to like pay for a subscription for it anymore. And that was also really changing. So morally, I just like, I didn't find that like what I was interested in wanting to work on and support, like just those things were diverging. Like I said, you know, the dev process timeline when using Unity, it just like started kind of growing and growing and growing. And I started like getting invested in these things that I really didn't get, you know, really didn't want to like spend a lot of time getting invested in. So I just like felt like the way that the software was developing wasn't what I was interested in making. So those things kind of started to diverge. And as a person that's used Blender as a 3D modeling software for like 15 years or something, for a really long time, what feels like maybe 15 years, a really long time, I've always been really inspired by free or Libre open source software, and the communities that that type of software really supports and nurtures, and the kind of way in which those communities are both open and welcoming, and you know are really about, you know, trying to get people interested in the development process and be kind of like both educational and mindful of the ways in which like a lot of different people want to use the software that's being developed in a lot of different ways. And that really excited me, and something that I've been following in Godot since like the 3.0 release. So maybe, I guess I don't know, but how long that's been, but I have been following Godot for like quite a while and its development arc. And recently I was like, you know what, after making my last survey, I'm going to really try to like invest some time into like learning Godot and make the switch. So, but maybe all of this could be summarized in just like this screen. I threw this in here, like maybe just as like a joke, which is like, I feel like I was just experiencing like this screen a lot with Unity. And whenever I tried to like use the software or teach the software, I just felt like it became so cumbersome to work with. And I really wanted something way more on the fly, something that allowed me to prototype and work through ideas and sketch through ideas in a much quicker way. Cool. So that's like all for my like little preamble. And what I think I'm gonna do is that I'm gonna we're gonna jump into Godot like right away. So let's do that. So if you can open up Godot really quickly, I feel like I should maybe walk through these processes just like a little bit like slower. But if you open up Godot for the first time, it's gonna open up this like launcher. So let's see if I can actually show that to you. So I'm gonna go to this like project manager launcher, and I gotta switch my my stuff over here really quickly. So I'm gonna go to this screen. Oh, great! Actually, it has it loaded up. That's really good. So it's gonna, when you open up Godot for the first time, you'll notice that the version that I'm running is 3.3.3, and then this like stable mono build, which means that I could use C# if I want to. I'm not going to be using any C# in this class or in this little demo. I'm just going to be using gdscript. So yeah, thanks so much, Lee, for posting that link in case you didn't get a chance to download Godot yet. So you can use 3.3.3 or 3.3 plus. Godot actually just released 3.4. As far as I could tell from like the little bits of research notes that I've done in prep for this class today, or this like little workshop, it doesn't seem like that there's huge differences between what I'm going to be building in the version that I have in 3.4. So if you want to just download the most latest version of 3.4, I think it should be okay. If you're worried about it, 3.3 plus should be totally good for what we're going to be doing. You'll notice that I have some demo projects here, or some like projects that are already like loaded into this like little launcher. But you're going to like come into having this this version that you're going to see on the screen, or some a window that looks like something similar on the screen. Yeah, standard is totally okay. I see that that question. Standard is totally good. I typically use I've been using gdscript in my workflow. When I was programming in Unity, I was using C#. So when I first started to try to make the transition, I really wanted to try to learn, or wanted to try to apply the C# knowledge that I had to gdscript. But I found that that was really difficult for me to try to translate those things. So I just decided, you know what, I'm not going to try to do that, and I'm really going to try to learn gdscript, which is the native programming language for Godot. For people that don't know, and we'll kind of get into this a little bit later, for people that don't know, gdscript is very similar to Python. The way that you declare variables and the way that you work within that software is very similar. So we're going to be looking at ways in which we can kind of use the native programming language within Godot and not rely on C# so much. If that seems a little bit daunting to you, don't stress, right? We're going to be trying to take this really slow and take this one step at a time. So you'll be presented with a screen, like I was saying, that looks somewhat like this. It'll have these like demo projects that you might see. But we can just go ahead and start a new project if we want to. So you can either go to new project right here. You can click on new project and put that in a folder of your choosing. You can create a folder wherever you want to. I find that OpenGL ES 3.0 is totally fine. Again, for the purposes of what we're doing, we're not going to be doing any like high-end visual graphics today. So if you're worried about that, like running on your computer, you can always like put OpenGL ES 2.0. But assign a project folder for where you want this to be. It should be fine wherever you want it to be. I think the only thing that I would say is like make sure that it's a folder that you have permissions to, if that's something that you're worried about on your personal computer. It's never been an issue for me, but if that's a thing for you, just make sure. And then you can click, like I didn't, you can click create and edit when you're ready. I'm going to click cancel because I already have a little demo project here that I'm just going to go ahead and open up and run edit. So I hope that this should automatically switch. Yep, it does. Cool. Excellent. So I'm just going to wait 1 second here while we're like kind of getting things started and just like loading things in. And hopefully getting people to the same point of loading Godot on their screen. So hopefully people have got stuff loaded in, and we can go ahead and get started. So what I want to work on, and what was kind of advertised as part of this workshop today, is to make a very simple 3D kind of walking simulator like level that has a first-person camera that you use the mouse to look around and WASD to move around. And then a small interactable, and this interactable will be an object in our scene that we will kind of collide with, and when we do that collision and press a certain key for interacting, something will happen, right? So it's very bare bones, but kind of learning those steps or doing all those steps together, we're hopefully going to be looking at a lot of different ways in which we can kind of translate some of those skills from Godot, or excuse me, from Unity into Godot. But I thought that it would be helpful, before getting kind of into the weeds too much with like translating those differences and those skills, I thought it would be really helpful for us to just like jump into software, start playing around with it, get interested in how it's being made, or how the architecture works, and looking at how we can just like start creating some stuff. So to create a really quick prototype, what we're going to do is that we're going to kind of do this the way that this lesson is going to go is that we're going to do some stuff in Godot. I'm going to go back to that presentation that you saw and break down some of these differences that I've seen and some of the main hurdles that I've kind of experienced in terms of trying to work through translating these skills, and then come back to Godot and kind of finish and do a little bit more polish on the project that we started, and then add some more assets and 3D things and do that interaction layer that we had talked about. But first, we're going to build out, the first thing that I want us to do is that we're going to build out together our first-person controller, our first-person camera controller, and we're going to create our very first node tree to do that, and then we're going to instance that node tree in a different scene that then we'll be able to kind of test that first-person controller in. Cool? If I just said some vocabulary and some like language or jargon that you don't understand, don't worry about it. We'll be talking about it all together, and I'll be outlining it in much more detail as we go through this lesson. But the short thing to understand is the way that Unity, or excuse me, I'm going to be probably doing that all day. I'm going to try to be really specific with it. The main thing that to understand and how Godot works is through nodes, right? So in Unity, we would call these things game objects, right? In Godot, we call them nodes. And I'm going to talk about the differences and the details of how those nodes work differently from game objects going forward. But the way that we create projects is through a succession of building nodes kind of on top of each other or in relation to one another through what are called node trees. Cool. So that's very similar to thinking about like a hierarchy, right, in Godot. So for us, for this project, for this kind of just getting started doing some stuff, I want to create this first-person camera rig, like a very, very rudimentary rig, and I'm going to kind of demo and prototype that in a kind of main file. Cool. So I'm going to create what are called two scenes. I'm going to create my first-person camera scene, and I'm going to create my main scene. So when you've opened this up for the very first time, we're going to hopefully get to a point where we get to something that looks like this, right? We have our main game root node, and then we have a mesh instance of just a plane, and then our first-person camera scene that's loaded in as an instance into this kind of main game node tree. So again, I'm going to try to be using that vocabulary as much as I can, and I'm going to try to be mindful of the way in which these different things can kind of translate from one software to the other. So for us, though, let's create our first scene. So I'm going to, down here, let's kind of like walk through the way that things look in Godot first, the interface here. So over here in the upper left-hand corner, we have our scene area, right? And our scene area shows the hierarchy of our scene, of our current scene that we have loaded. It shows what's the main root of that scene, and then all of the children of that main root, or siblings, right? These would be siblings in that tree. And this is going to be kind of the way that we organize and structure our game. Cool? Or I should say our scene. Right below that is our file system. You can kind of think about this as like our project file, where we have all of what are called our resources. And that would be equivalent to our assets, right? That's kind of our raw material of what we're going to be using in our scenes, right? So they're not nodes, but they'll be scripts, or you'll see that I have, for instance, right, these objects that I've made for today's lesson, right? Some scripts, and we also have our scenes, right? So all of the resources, all of the raw material that we're going to be using is going to be stored in this file system section here. Cool. In the middle, we have what's called our workspace. And our workspace, actually, we're going to be using 3 different workspaces today. We're going to be using our 2D workspace, our 3D workspace, and our script workspace. Cool. So we're going to focus a little bit, just getting started, in our 3D workspace and our script workspace. But this is how, we kind of will see kind of our scene in as it were, like an editing space, or like in an edit mode. Cool. The way that you navigate around in the 3D space is that you can middle mouse click and rotate like this. Okay. You can shift middle mouse click, and you can pan, and then scrolling, you can go in and out like that. Cool. You can also use the kind of 3D widget up here in the upper right-hand corner of your 3D view in case you don't have a 3-button mouse. There's also these kind of locked orthographic camera modes. Again, this is probably going to be pretty similar to people that have used 3D before, but in case you haven't, that's okay, right? But you could still kind of, I think if you hold shift here, I'm trying to think how you might be able to pan around. I think that that's okay. I think that hopefully if anybody doesn't have a 3-button mouse handy and you need to pan around, that's okay. As a nice thing too, I tend to also say, if you select any node in your scene and you hit F, while you have your mouse over in the workspace area, it will focus your camera on that. So if you have trouble panning around or anything like that, you can always just select something up here and then hit F. Cool. Okay, that's it for the workspace. I'll get into more details about the workspace in just a bit. And then over here on the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see the inspector. And that should be really common vocabulary for people that have used Unity before. If you haven't used Unity before, that's totally okay. The inspector is where basically the information or data or variables and properties of the different nodes that you have selected, right? So this is a context-specific menu over here. So depending on what I have selected, right, in my hierarchy, right, or in my node tree, right, my inspector will change and it will show me information, data, properties, values, and so on and so forth of my scene here. Seems like a great point. Right click and then WASD. Cool, perfect. That's great. Awesome, cool. Thanks for that. Yeah, good. If you haven't used Unity before, don't worry about it. Also, it's licensing. Yeah, that's another one of those maybe bullet points that was on my initial reasons for making the switch too. Cool. So you don't have anything like this in your scene. Obviously, you haven't built out these things yet. So let's go ahead and do that together. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to go ahead and click this plus sign here up below my scene. You might have something that just looks like a 2D node, 3D node, and some other things there. But if you go ahead and click the plus sign, we're just going to make a new, actually, let's do this kind of a better way. Yeah, I'm going to right click here in my resource folder. Sorry about that. I'm going to right click here and I'm going to say new scene. And I'll go ahead and just name this, I'll name this demo. Demo main. Demo main is good. That seems good. I'm going to click OK. Right, this is the thing that I was talking about. 2D scene, 3D scene, or a user interface. And we're going to go ahead and click on 3D scene. And so what that's going to create is that it's going to create what's called a spatial node, right? And this spatial node is basically the kind of baseline node for creating a 3D tree, basically. So we're going to actually change this node to be something a little bit different right from the hop. But I want to make sure that people understand that a spatial node is basically like, you can think of this as like an empty, right, in Unity. It basically has nothing in it besides transform information. Cool. Why do we make a separate scene to construct the first person? I will answer that question in just 1 second. You're going to see why we're going to do that. It's basically the way that Godot is fundamentally different from Unity in the way in which the architecture exists. So I will definitely answer that question, or hopefully it makes a little bit more sense as we go through the next little stuff. Cool. So what we're going to do here is that I'm going to just save this. Right, I'm going to save demo main, and I'm just going to rename this spatial scene, or excuse me, spatial node, and I'm just going to name this whatever, main, main tree, something like that. I think main tree is totally good for what we need. Cool. So I'm going to click save, and I get into the habit of trying to save as much as possible. I just do Control S to do that. It's just kind of like a nervous tick that I have, so I'm going to be saving a lot. And let's go ahead and create a new scene where our first person camera is going to be living. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to right click, say new scene, and let's say FPS cam, something like that. and that seems good. Cool. And I'm going to go ahead and create another 3D scene here. Cool. Now, this is what I was saying before about that I'm going to change this fundamental node here, because what I want are basically the root node of this to be something that I know that's going to be affected by my key press inputs and is also going to be affected by the physics simulation that I have in basically that runs in Godot. So in order to do that, I'm going to create what's called a kinematic body, right? Or I'm not going to create, I should be more specific. I'm going to change the type of what this scene is to be a kinematic body. So I'm going to right click on spatial where it says spatial, and I'm going to say change type. Cool. And I'm going to search for, in the top here, kinematic body. And as soon as I put in kina, right, I get kinematic body. And you'll see that this is a 3D node type that's underneath our physics. Cool. So I'm going to select kinematic body and just change that to be that kind of top level node. Now you'll notice here that I get actually a little bit of a warning or a little bit of an error here when I've made this new type, when I've changed my spatial node to be a kinematic body. Let's go ahead and also rename this while I'm here, and I'll just rename this something like FPS player, something like that. Cool. Now, in order for this node to work, it needs to have different collision shapes attached to it. And so this is going to be one of these kind of big differences between Unity and Godot, right? And I'll get into the kind of outline of this a little bit later, but I need to add nodes to this kinematic body node that have collision attached to it in order for this kind of kinematic body to behave in the way that it's intended. So I'm going to add some nodes to this kind of top level kinematic body FPS player. So I'm going to go ahead and hit this plus sign again, and I'm going to search for collision shape. Okay, so there's collision polygon and collision shape. I want collision shape. Cool. So I'm going to add a collision shape, double click on that. And I'm actually going to add another collision shape to this. Right, so I'm going to click on my FPS player again, and I'm going to click add, and that has loaded into it the last search that I did. So I'm going to do collision shape again, click create, and now I have these two collision shape child nodes, right, attached to my FPS player. So what I need to do, so you'll notice that the kind of little warning error that I had for my FPS player is gone, but now I have little warnings for my collision shapes. And that's because I haven't assigned yet a shape for these two nodes. Cool. And I'm going to do that really quickly and really easily. The first thing that I'm going to do is that I'm going to rename this first collision shape to be called body. Cool. And I'm going to rename my second collision shape to be called feet. Cool. And these two collision shapes are ostensibly going to be the different things that I want my controller to collide with the rest of my environment. So my body, this might be familiar for people that have done some game development before. My body is going to be a capsule shape, just because that's kind of a nice default or a good kind of industry default. Also, it's really helpful that it has a curved bottom in case I want to go up some slopes. And my feet shape is going to be a kind of rectangle or a box. So I'm going to select my body node, my body collision shape node. And you'll see over here in the inspector the shape that I have. It currently says empty, and that's why I'm getting that little warning. And I'm going to click on that. I'm going to say new capsule shape. So I've gotten rid of that little warning that I had there, and I have now this kind of highlighted blue outline that shows me, that collision shape that I've added to this node. I'm going to go ahead and add the other collision shape, my feet, by adding the shape or including in the shape here. If I just click on empty, I'm going to say new box shape. Great. So I've gotten rid of those warnings that say like, hey, for this node behavior to work properly, you really need to have a collision shape loaded into these different collision shape nodes. And so we've just done that. So I'm going to reconfigure the parameters of my collision shape to kind of get the type of rig that I want my character to kind of have. So I'm going to first rotate this rig along the x-axis to be 90 degrees so that the collision, that capsule shape is kind of facing upward, has a Y up, if you will. And I'm going to click where it says capsule. That will actually load where I have the different properties of the capsule shape itself. And I'm going to modify the radius by just clicking where it says 1, and I'm going to say 0.5, okay? Just to make that radius a little bit tighter in. Cool, so now I have a capsule shape that looks, pretty good to me. And what I want to do for the feet is that you can actually do this using these red handles on the collision shape itself. So I'm going to use these red handles to get an approximation of the shape that I want. And I'm actually going to go to the kind of top display here by clicking on this Y. I can click on this Y right on my kind of 3D gizmo here, or I can hit, if you have a numpad on your keyboard, if you hit the numpad 7, that will also take you to the top. I'm going to kind of scale this down so that I'm basically getting it so that the corners of that are extended beyond the circle or the kind of sphere shape of the capsule, so that it's kind of sticking out a little bit from the sides. And I can kind of shrink this down so that it's not too prominent. Once I've kind of used those handles here, I'm going to go to the transform and just see go to the box shape here and see what those kind of gave me. Okay, so I'm going to just make these kind of more whole, or not whole, but easier to read numbers. So I'm going to say 0.4 for the X, 0.1 for the Y, and 0.4 for the Z to get that kind of nice rectangular shape. And yeah, that seems pretty good to me. 0.4 seems pretty good. Maybe 0.45 would be better, but that seems like a good step. The first step of that, which step do you mean, Strawberry? In terms of remaking the shape or adding a capsule shape here? Sorry, I'm just going to hold to, I know there's a little bit of a delay. The transformation. So what I did here is that if you click on the collision shape node, you see these kind of red, they're like little red handles on the side. You can kind of use those to reshape the size of that box. Cool. So I just did that to get a rough estimation of the values then that I'm going to put in the what are called the extents of that box shape. Cool. Hopefully that answers your question. Really quickly while we're here, because I'm going to want to kind of make some changes to the way that these are positioned, right, in relation to one another, is that if you notice in the 3D workspace, I have some tools up here in the upper left-hand corner. I have the move tool, the rotate tool, and the scale tool. They kind of have different handles attached to each one of those, so I can look at those. The reason why I wasn't doing that for changing the scale on this is that I actually don't want to change the scale of the object itself. I wanted to change the extents of the object. And then I'm going to be kind of using this kind of pointer tool, which allows me to select, different things that I want to select, kind of easily. So I can select each node as I'm kind of working. Cool. But what I'm going to do, is that I'm going to, now that I've made the extents of this, I'm going to move this down to be, where the feet ought to be on this capsule. So I'm going to click on the X here. Oops. Click on the X. I'm going to kind of move this down to be down here. And I can actually see, I actually want to scale this out because I want to make this a little bit so that it is kind of making sure that it's colliding out right from the front and the side. So maybe 0.5 is a little bit better, to use than 0.4. Yeah, that seems a bit better because I want to make sure that when I have this as a feet, what this is doing is basically preventing me from slipping down slopes, right? So that if I am on a curved surface or if I'm on a slope surface, that eventually the end or the bottom of my collider will kind of catch on that, and it will prevent me from sliding any further. Cool. And so the last kind of nodes that I want to set up here are going to be the way that my camera is going to work. And so for me, I want to make sure that my camera is always going to be rotating in a particular direction that's independent of the direction that my body is facing. Okay, so I'm going to want to create a node that can rotate based upon my mouse look, but is not going to change the direction in which I'm really walking, right? I kind of want to keep those things separate. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to add another spatial node to my FPS player. So I'll just search for spatial. Okay. I'm going to click create, and I'm going to name this pivot. Okay, and that's going to be pretty important that I name it pivot, and we're going to see why that is in just 1 second. And then I'm going to attach the camera of my first-person camera controller to the pivot. So while I have pivot selected, the pivot node selected, I'm going to click plus again and search for camera. And I'll select just the basic camera. Cool. So I have my camera here. It's attached to a pivot node, pivot spatial node, which again, you can kind of just think of as being an empty, but we're going to be using that pivot to be the thing that's kind of controlling the way that we're rotating around. So because of that, I'm going to move that pivot up to be kind of more eye level with my kind of capsule here. I'm just going to kind of make it align a little bit with that kind of upper, it's kind of hard to see with the background, but the upper top of my capsule before it starts kind of curving to that dome. So here seems good. I could always modify this later, but somewhere where it's kind of close to that section, or that segment, I should say. Cool. So this looks good to me. I'm happy with this. And again, the reason why I'm doing this is that I want my pivot, right? I want to be able to rotate my camera, right, independently, as it were, right, from, and I'm going to just undo those to make sure that they're fine, independently from the way that my body overall is pivoting and changing. Cool. So I want those things to be separate from one another, because I want my camera look to be, again, separate from the way or the direction that my body is facing. Cool. Gwen is not far off, and we are going to get there in just 1 second, I promise. Yes, it is very similar to that concept. Okay, cool. So because I wanted to make this workshop like kind of quicker and easier, a little bit more lightweight, I actually provided y'all with a script that's this player gdscript that I posted in the link before. It was this tiny URL link. I'm going to make sure that it's maybe, oh, got it. Thanks, Lee. I'm going to use that player GD link into Godot. So I already have it loaded into my project, but if you want to load a resource into your project, I find that the easiest thing to do is actually to drag and drop that into your res file. So you can either do that by dragging from your Explorer, and you can directly kind of plop that into your project. Or in fact, I'm going to kind of delete the one that I have, and I'll go ahead and remove that. No big deal. I'm going to get rid of this. So I'm dragging this. I know you might not be able to see this because you can just see Godot, but if I drag this over into my scene, you should be able to, over into my res file, you should be able to see player.gd right now in your res file. Yes, sorry. Absolutely. The pivot is just a plain spatial node. Yes, 100%. Cool. So I've loaded my player .gd script into my res file, and I'm going to attach this to my FPS player. So I'm going to go ahead and click and drag that onto my FPS player. Cool. And you'll note that a little icon gets added to my FPS player, which is this kind of little script icon. Cool. So if I click on that, it will actually switch me over to the script workspace. Sorry, I want to make sure that I was using my vocabulary correctly. And oh, I thought that I had saved this before, but there's actually some extra stuff here that we can get rid of really quickly that we won't be using as part of today's lesson. This is kind of actually somewhat cannibalized code from another project that I'm working on. But most of the things here are going to be relevant for us. But the things that we're going to get rid of is this onReady var player position. We actually don't need that. And then also what we want to get rid of is in func ready, or the ready function. I'm going to get rid of anything that says player position, any of that stuff, and just go ahead and get rid of that. Cool. Again, sorry, I should have clarified that point before. I should have updated that script before uploading it. I'm so sorry about that. But I wanted to just kind of say that. Sorry, I see that there's some questions here. Is creating a copy of file somewhere appropriate? Absolutely. Or should I move it in from the downloads folder? Once you move it into your res file, that's a really great question. Once you move it into your res file, it will then live in your Godot file. So if you actually right click on any resource that you have here, if you right click and go to show in file manager, it will show you then where that object actually lives on your computer. Cool. So when you created your project file, it actually says that, when you created that, like Unity, it creates this resources file, and it creates this like a whole file structure for you to be able to load things into. So yes, it looks like it gets copied to whatever folder you set when you made the project. Perfect way of describing it. Absolutely. Yes, I will repeat that. No problem. I hope that I'm having trouble getting the script in there. I hope that's not too big of an issue. I would say that, again, you can either drag it into your, let's see if I can show this in just showing my whole screen. Let me see if I can do this. I'm going to see if I can add this. This is kind of going to freak out. Oh, let's see. Okay, so what I had done is that I have this folder here. For instance, I had downloaded this on my personal computer, so it should still be in my downloads. Where is that? I haven't downloaded it, but it should be in your downloads folder. And if you just drag it and drop it into your resources in Godot, it should populate that there pretty easily. Hopefully that answers that question. Okay, cool. Awesome. Okay, I'm going to watch out, everybody. I'm about to turn y'all into a psychedelic landscape. Okay, cool. So now that we've got this in here, I don't want to spend a ton of time going through the script. I will absolutely go through this a little bit, but there are some things that we should just pay attention to, which is a function that we're doing here that's called getInput. And this input is looking for a vector3, a variable vector3, which we're calling input direction. And we're basically changing the input direction, that vector3, based upon input stuff that we are going to map in just 1 second altogether, right? Once we've kind of got that, once we've got the input direction here, we're then basically saying in a process here, we're then going to basically process the physics of this using the velocity of our kinematic body, which again is the type of node that we have here loaded in. And we're basically changing that with the getInput command that we have written up here, and we're changing the max speed based upon a variable that we've made up here. So again, I'm not going to get too dense into this code in particular. because we're going to be writing some gdscript together, and I'm going to walk through that process in more detail then. But suffice to say, this is kind of how the back end of this code works. And again, I want to make sure that this script is attached to the topmost node of my kinematic body in player. You'll notice too that I have loaded a camera node, which is looking for the pivot and then main cam. And if you remember when I said naming pivot is going to be really important, it's also going to be really important to name main cam or the camera that we made the correct name. So I'm going to also rename this main cam, because again, if I look at the script that I sent to y'all, or that hopefully you've been able to incorporate in your project, I'm looking for this particular node main cam in my project, and of course modifying that based upon some input that I've designed down here. Cool. You can double click on player.gd to load it into the script workspace, or once you've dragged it onto your FPS player, right, you can click on the script icon here and it will take you to the script workspace. Again, the script icon being what's attached to your FPS player node. Cool. Hopefully that makes sense. It's a great question. Max 1 script per node. So no, but it is very difficult, I found in my experience, to access which script you want to have attached to your node at particular times. So I hope that we're going to try to avoid adding more than one script at a time to different nodes. So I would be reluctant to say that you can add more than one script. Godot will allow you, but it becomes quite difficult to then access that script after the fact. Nothing to correct there. Drag and drop onto FPS player. Let's not get into lingo just yet, because we're going to cover a whole thing about that in just 1 second. But best practices would be to add more nodes. Yep, more empty spatial nodes if you need to, or whatever node you need to access. Okay, so we've created this camera rig together. I'm just kind of paying attention to time, and I want to be mindful of that. So we've created this rig together. Now that we've completed this rig, let's go ahead and see if we can test this to see if this works. So I'm going to go back to my demo main node. And what I'm going to do here is that I'm not going to add a new node, right? A new kind of empty node. I'm going to add that FPS cam node tree, or I should say that scene, to this node. Okay. So this is maybe hopefully answering some of the questions that were brought up at the beginning of why would you do it this way? And we're going to get into more detail about the architecture in just 1 second. But think of it this way. I have this main tree here that's going to be comprised of lots of different nodes. Some of those nodes are going to be, just the nodes that we had made, right? These different types of built-in nodes. And some of them are going to be custom nodes that are going to be scenes that I have made. So in order to add that FPS cam scene to my main tree here, I'm going to click on this kind of link button next to the plus button. And it will ask me what instance child scene I want to add. And I'm going to click on FPS cam. And I'll click open. So I've now added that scene to, right, my main root node. I can kind of move this up and around. And to test this, to see if this main camera works, and I hope it does for everybody, I'm going to add a very simple plane. Excuse me, just hit my mic. I'm going to add a very, very simple plane with collision attached to it that allows us to kind of walk around and see if this works. And then I'm also going to, I have to do one more step, I realize, where all of us have to include the input information, right? That we have this input is action press. So maybe actually let's do that first before we add our plane to our scene, because this is going to, make a lot of difference. So in Unity, there's this whole new thing that's called the input mapper or the input stuff, and you can do a lot of different things in using that, and it's kind of really handy in some instances. But for Godot, that's actually way more straightforward. So if I actually go to Project and go to Project Settings, you'll notice that one of the little tabs here at the top is called the input map. And so I've already made these, so I'm actually going to kind of trash these so that we do this process together. But we can add any number of different new inputs here that are custom to our game. So again, following along to what I have, and I want to make sure that this is showing up. I hope that this is showing up on the stream. I don't know if it actually is. I'm just waiting for it to catch up. Cool, great. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to add an action by going to the top here that says action, and I'm going to say move _ forward, and I'm going to add that. And for me, I'm going to be using this WASD convention, like I said, and I'm going to just click this plus sign to where it says move forward and say add a key. And so it's going to say what key do I want, and I'm going to say W. It says OK. And I'm going to do that for the other action. So move _ back, add that, and then add a key action. And I'll say S for that. Clicks OK. I'm going to say move _ ooh, excuse me, it's not move. It's called strafe _ left. Click add. And then I'll add the A key. And strafe _ right. Click add a key, and hit D. Cool. Great. So I've set up my WASD for move forward, move back, strafe left, and strafe right. And again, this input map is being then called in my getInput function on my FPS camera. So once I've set up that, it'll automatically save that these inputs have been mapped to these keys, so I can click close. I'll go back to my 3D workspace by clicking 3D here at the top. And I'm going to save this because I am, again, kind of have that little bit of a nervous itch to make sure that I'm saving. And I'm going to add a plane to my scene that basically will just act as a collider that I can walk on, and so that we can test to make sure that this FPS player works correctly. So I want to be mindful of how I'm adding this node to my tree. So I'm going to make sure that I'm clicking main tree when I'm adding this node. So when I click on main tree, I'm going to click add child node, and I'm going to search for mesh instance. Okay, I just searched for mesh, and I want mesh instance. Cool. So I'm going to click create on that, and we're going to create a very, very simple thing. Physical key versus key. Is that in the input? I just want to make sure. We want, it should just be, it's key for me. It should just be key. I hope that that's, I'm going to say just key. It might be a 3.4 thing. Yeah, totally. So if yours says physical key, but it has a similar icon, then we're going to trust and make sure that it has it. Cool. Oh, if you have physical key or key, I would say key then. Cool. Great. I'm going to say key. Okay. So I created my mesh instance here. I'm going to rename this just like floor, something very easy to understand. And I'm going to add a mesh, right? We see in the mesh instance kind of variables here, or the properties, I should say. I'm going to add a mesh where it says empty, and I'm just going to say new plane mesh. Cool. And I'm going to kind of click where the plane is, like where that loaded in. And I'm going to change the size of the X and Y to this to be, I'll change it to 10. I think 10 will be enough room for right now for us to kind of do the little bit of prototyping that we want to. We can make this, I don't know, let's make it 20 because we're going to be making some space here that we can kind of play around and mess around in. Cool. And again, I want to make sure that my little FPS controller is kind of resting above the floor. So once I've created that mesh instance, okay, that has the correct size, that's 20 by 20 on the X and Y. Okay, I don't need to worry about skin. That's totally fine. I'm going to click in the 3D workspace. You can actually see where this mesh kind of new menu that's been made. I'm going to click mesh, and this is a really nice kind of quick shortcut that I can make. Instead of just adding a bunch of different nodes and things like that to this, which we can definitely do the long way, I'm going to take a little shortcut here, and I'm going to say create tri-mesh static body. Okay, and you'll notice that adds some new children to my floor. But what that has basically done is that this has added collision to that mesh that will be kind of static, right? It won't be moving, it won't be kinetic, so that when my character, right, is loaded in, that it will hopefully collide with the floor. Cool. So to now test to see that this is all working the way that we want it to, I'm going to go up here to the upper right-hand corner, which is where our play controls are, and I'm going to hit the play button that has a clapper, that has this kind of film clapper attached to it, this play scene, or it even gives you the kind of little tooltip here that it's F6. So I'll try that. It will compile. Okay, cool. And I have my mouse looking around, and if I hit W, hopefully it allows me to walk forward. If I hit S, I can strafe, right? And using the mouse around is good. And I also built in here, just for convenience sake, that if you hit escape, you should be able to get your mouse back so that you can close this out. So I'm just gonna, I'm not seeing the game screen. Okay, cool. I realize that that's a different scene. So sorry, everybody. Let me turn my display capture back on. Oops. So let's do that one more time. Hopefully now you can see it. So moving, right, W, my mouse movement is allowing me to look up, look down, look left, look right, right? So that I can move around. And when I hit escape, right, it escapes out. Cool. Right, I realize that this is going to be a little bit hairy, but hopefully you can see it. I think because I missed which bits of the play. If we want to go back, that's totally fine. We can debug this together. If we want to go back to the script, the things that I removed were at the top here. I had an onReady player POS, I believe. I got rid of that. And then in func ready, in the ready function here, I got rid of anything that said player POS. So I just left this input set mouse mode, input mouse captured. Cool. Because it's basically that I apologize again. That stuff is kind of left over from some code. So it might be something that's lingering, that's giving you some errors. Great. Yeah, so sorry. Again, that's totally on me. So it basically what that player position was doing was trying to record some information that's like not existing in our current game setup. So that's probably why you're getting that error. The argument function, if it is never used in the, that's really odd. If this is intended to see, Zoizone. I wonder if that's because you might have loaded this as a C# as opposed to a gdscript. The function, okay, yeah. If it runs, then I would say it's okay. I'm gonna kind of like say this caveat now, right? It's like, I too am still like getting started and trying to like translate a lot of this knowledge. I haven't, if you make sure, so if you make sure that here where it has player.gd, you want to make sure that that's player.gd and not player.cs. So you might have created a CS file. I'm not so sure. Yeah, there is a, sorry, my heat just came on. I'm so sorry. I'm really sorry. My heat, I have Steam heat, and so that hiss is coming on. So sorry. Yeah, Zoizone, that's probably in player.gd. Oh, it is player.gd. I would say if it's not being an issue right now, then don't sweat it. It might be just giving you a warning because you're using the mono standard. So this is actually kind of a frustrating thing, Lee. I actually can't really zoom in here. Like, I really wish that I could. Let me see if I can try to do it in, I'm gonna try to see if I can do it in OBS. But basically what I had here at the top was that I had another onReady var that was called player_POS. You can get rid of that, and then in the ready function, if you get rid of anything that references player POS, you want to also get rid of that. Yeah, lines 4, 8 through 11. Thank you so much for that help. Yeah, I know that this helps. It is super frustrating. Actually, it was like one of the biggest things that I searched for, and like how to make the type more visible in Godot, and people have apparently been like working on this. I guess there might be a way of doing it, but I haven't found an easy way just yet. But hopefully resizing that makes it a little bit more visible. You just control plus minus. Yeah, that doesn't work for me. Oh, what? Da, 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 da. Yo, I must have just not had text selected to do that. Well, that's really frustrating. Cool, so that's how it works. Great. Hold on, let me just resize this to make this fit to screen. Cool. So way more legible. Oh my god, that's so great. Cool. See, we can learn things together. I'm getting the window to load, but I get attempt to call function rotate x, but the base null is okay. So what that might mean, or what the reason for that is that you want to make sure that the name of the node pivot/main camera is the same in your FPS camera here, right? So that you have pivot main cam, right? These are named the same here. Otherwise, this camera, right, whatever it's trying to access, won't load properly. Cool? So if you're trying to do rotate X on that pivot, right, this pivot is not going to be loading. So you want to make sure that this is case sensitive here, right? And you want to make sure that this script is again loaded to the topmost node. Okay? Again, the FPS player, right, and not in demo main. You want to attach to FPS player. Cool. Your pivot has disappeared. Okay, so make sure that in your FPS cam scene, right, you can add, right, a spatial node here, right, and then you can name that pivot and add the main. You can add a camera as a child to that pivot. That's called main cam. Hopefully that helps. Yeah, it's only within that window. Yeah, totally. Sorry, I'm just catching up on. And then after that, sorry, Lee, can you be more specific? After that, adding the pivot and then adding the main cam. After that, it should be okay. And making sure that, again, that the script is attached to the FPS camera, right, and not to the main tree. I would probably have to like look at your screen, unfortunately. I don't know how I can do that right now. What I would say is that if you want to, you can try, what I would say is try doing this. If you have, so right now we have SPS player loaded as a scene, right, a scene node, if you will, in my main tree. If I right click on FPS player and I say make local, then I can see all of the nodes here, right, that I have loaded in that scene. So what I would say is to make sure that if you have this, right, to make sure that this is loaded in the same way. Yes, the name matters in the code. The script explicitly mentions pivot main cam, right? So you want to make sure that you have main cam, absolutely, yes. Apologies if I to reiterate this point, this node main cam, right, the script here at the top where I'm calling this node, and again, I'll kind of get into the syntax of this a little bit more later, right? This main cam, right, is being loaded in, right, by looking for this, basically this tree path. Cool? So hopefully that solves that issue. Okay, so I'm going to kind of take a detour, and I'm going to kind of go back to my presentation really quickly because I want to talk about some of the fundamental differences of what we just did and how they relate to some hurdles that I've experienced in trying to translate my knowledge from Unity into Godot. Again, if you've never used Unity before, hopefully this information is still helpful and like relevant to you. If it's something that is going a little bit over your head, the intention here is to try to understand that the paradigm of using Godot, the way that Godot's architecture is built, is quite unique from other game engines. So the reason why I'm making these comparisons, even if you haven't used Unity in the past, is to still kind of understand like how these engines are architecturally speaking are quite different. So I'm going to go back to my presentation, and I'm going to talk about this in a little bit more detail. So I'm going to try to go through this presentation pretty quickly because we're already a little bit over the hour, and I want to make sure that we do a couple of more things. Cool. So one of the we've already talked through a lot of these fundamental differences, right? But like Unity runs on game objects where Godot runs on nodes. Again, I hope that like has become kind of explicitly relevant or explicitly kind of made to everybody. But you think about this in a way that in Godot these hierarchies actually matter, right? So the way that I'm calling my nodes in my node tree, specifically in that example of looking at pivot and then main cam, right? Those things really matter. So being able to load things within the hierarchy and understanding the relationship that they have to one another is much more discrete than in Unity. In Unity, you can load things in by dragging and dropping things into the interface, and there is a way of doing that in Godot. It just is not kind of like done natively, typically. It's done much more by loading things based on their node and their relationship to one another. So that's something that's like really, really different between the two, in my opinion, really, really different between the two engines. So leading that into my next point here, which is architectural discernment is very, very important. And what I mean by architectural discernment, that's a very, perhaps like, $10 word, right, for thinking about the way that your game is built, right? So knowing how each node is behaving and how the parents and children and siblings of those nodes behave in relation to one another is way more important and way more impactful in Godot than in Unity. And we're seeing kind of the fruits of that, like in the little demo that we've been doing together, right? We're seeing how the way in which the relationship between our nodes in our hierarchy really matters. But more importantly, when we start making larger and larger projects, or when we start kind of building upon the central node, understanding where both our objects exist within that hierarchy, and then also know where we want different different nodes to send signals or information or data or change properties or change variables is going to be incredibly important, right? Again, because of the way that the hierarchy works, but also because of the way that gdscript works. And we're going to look at an example of that together. So Godot is forgiving, I would say much more forgiving than Unity, but it is less predictable. And again, we're kind of seeing the fruits of that, or maybe not the fruits, but the somewhat spoiled fruits perhaps of that within the little project that we've had. You'll notice that in Godot, when we were changing things around with our script or when we were loading things in, there wasn't a compiling process that was saying like, hey, this like thing that you're loading in here doesn't actually load anything, right? It only does that at runtime, right? So in Unity and in other game engines, there's typically a compiling process that checks to see like that all of the behaviors that you've programmed or all of the way that your hierarchies and game objects or whatever they might be that are interacting with one another is going to behave in the way that you expect, right? Or that in the way that you are intending. Godot doesn't have those same kind of debugging features or debugging kind of compilers. That stuff is run at runtime. That stuff it happens at the point of like launching your scene or at the point of creating your game. So although you can be quite nimble with how you're creating different scripts and creating different programming, there's going to be a little bit of back and forth. I would say a little bit more of a back and forth between what you intended to have happen and what is actually happening at the point of gameplay. But what's nice is that I would say that the workflow between launching your scenes and having them compile and run is way more smooth in Godot and is way more kind of like energy heavy in Godot. The last thing, and we kind of talked about this at the top, I find that Godot as a community, as a software, as a toolkit is growing and Unity is dying. I've seen a lot of people, a lot of devs, a lot of people that I follow basically leaving Unity after having worked in it for many, many years for various different reasons and going to different engines. Some people going to Godot, some people going to Unreal, some people going to GameMaker, a lot of different varieties of people exiting. But in general, I find that the community of people that are into supporting the further development of Unity is on the decline. I would give a particular note to a person that influenced me and made the process of learning Unity so much more enjoyable as Brackeys. If people are familiar with that YouTube channel and that community, the Brackeys community, they also run a game jam on itch. The fact that Brackeys is like, this is no longer a developing environment that I want to work in. I want to work on other things and move on to other things. As being someone so close to the development and the success and the lifeblood of that software, to kind of walk away from it, to me is maybe just an indication. And there's a lot of different reasons why people do this, but to me, it was kind of the beginning of the end for me, maybe. I don't know if other people feel the same way or if other people kind of have those moments in which kind of software kind of gets overripe and peaks. Anyways, okay, getting into these differences, I want to kind of run through a number of different ways in which there are ways that I've been kind of thinking about translating the concepts that I've learned in Unity over the past however many years that I've been using it into Godot. And number one is that everything is a prefab. Oop. And that's been something that was mentioned right at the top, right? That people were asking about, like, why would you build things architecturally this way, or why would you build a scene that has all these things and then like instance it later? In my experience, when you're thinking about the way that Unity is built, is that it's built through a combination of these different game objects that then get instanced, right, or then created or generated or instantiated through code or through different means and mechanisms, and that to do that kind of an effective or lightweight way or in a consistent way, you would make it into a prefab. It's the same applies here in Godot, except instead of it being like that you have to assign something to be a prefab. Instead, it's by default, if you make a scene, this scene operates as a node. And so then the way that your game runs is that actually it's just one entire main tree that's loading in and out scenes. And those scenes act as the way that other scenes or other things in Unity might act like a prefab. So we can get in kind of like the differences between those things and how they, it's not an exact equivalence, but it's something that I think is really important. Number two for me, and this is actually maybe a big one, maybe bigger than number one, there are no components in Godot. There's only nodes. So in the way that you would design things in Unity, you would create a game object and then you would attach various different components to it, like collision, like animation, like different things attached to it. But in Godot, you don't do that. So, oops, I don't know why that went back. Oh, I think it just went forward for some reason. Sorry, my slides kind of got messed up there. Traditionally in Unity, you'd make a series of game objects that have particular components, like I just said, that extend the original functionality. But in Godot, there's a node for that. How you arrange your nodes in your scene tree, it determines how those nodes behave and interact, and we've been talking about that. So what's really helped me in thinking about this is whenever I'm trying to find what would traditionally be a component in Unity, instead I say there's a node for that. So if we actually look at this, this is from a separate project. We haven't looked at this yet, but this is actually just an imported 3D model that I created a scene for when it became, when I imported it. And you'll actually notice that instead of it being, one individual spatial node that then has a bunch of components attached to it, right? Those things are kind of parsed out into different nodes, right? So this 3D model has a mesh renderer, right? And then it has collision with a collision shape attached to it, and then an animation player. So instead of these things being, kind of stacked onto each individual, right, like node, they're kind of separated out into discrete nodes that have particular behaviors, right? So that to me was like a huge hurdle to get over initially. Number three, scriptable objects, which is something that we might actually not have like a ton of time to talk about this today, but something that I found that was really important to me is understanding the differences between or how you would store, retrieve, and transmit data over a bunch of different objects within a game, right? Typically, you might do this in Unity with something called scriptable objects, or scriptable objects could be a handy way in which you could like store information or create like your own like kind of custom variables and data types. But in Godot, you would do that by adding scripts that behave as singletons that get loaded kind of above all of the tree. So we can kind of look at examples of this. But to me, what I find really interesting about this is that no longer is this like creating a kind of particular type of object, but instead it's assigning an existing or an existing resource as a node that then gets loaded in the root level of your tree. And we can actually look at how that looks in just 1 second. But yeah, just reiterating some of the points here, scriptable objects are ways of creating unique data types in Unity that can store additional data to be called or stored throughout your game. But to do that kind of high-level data in scripts, you use auto-loaded, you use something called singletons that are auto-loaded. So they're loaded in the root tree, and we can look at where that is in just 1 second. Cool. Number 4, there is no traditional canvas in Godot. Instead, there are 2D nodes, and we're going to look at this in just 1 second. Whoa, my slides are going nuts, I think because I don't know why that was. But in Godot, if you actually look, we kind of talked about this in just a second ago. We have multiple different types of workspaces. We've been looking at the 3D workspace and the 2D, the script workspace. But there's also a 2D workspace, which is where all of the HUD or UI elements and objects would live in your game. So you use 2D nodes, not 3D nodes like the spatial node, that are sorted and nested together in parent relationships that create like your canvas, layers, or your kind of HUD layers. So when you select or create a 2D node, it automatically switches to a 2D workspace. And we're going to look at a way in which we can kind of do that together with a little bit of interaction that we're hopefully going to get to today. Okay, number 5. I don't know why this keeps on freaking out on me. It just might be the way that OBS is working. I can give an example of that. Sorry, I didn't see that comment before I moved on. An example of when I would use a singleton, and again, it's not called a scriptable object in Godot, it's just called a singleton. An example of when I would use that is, let's say I had, we're going to do this actually together, but let's say I had, or again, I hope that we have time to do it. Let's say I had a collectible coin or something, and I wanted to store the data of how much that coin is worth or something to like a master controller, right? That master controller could be, just a node in your scene or in your scene tree. But if you wanted to kind of switch between multiple scenes or load in new scenes and unload other scenes, you would probably want to still hold on to the information of the amount of coins that you have in your hypothetical inventory, right? So you would use a singleton to do that, where the singleton would hold, an integer value of how many coins you had or whatever, the amount of gold that you had, and that would then carry over between different scenes that you have loaded. So depending on what that behavior might be, a good way of doing that would be like, it would be, typically like this kind of generic global state. Yep. That's how I have thought about using it. Yep. Cool. Getting back to my slides here. So instead of using get component, we'll use something that's called signals. And we're going to do this together. Again, this is the benchmark of what I've set out for us today, is to use signals to send data or information between different nodes in our hierarchy. So when you would want to access, as it says here, when you would want to access something in a component or a script or a variable or a property in another game object in Unity, you would create a little script that would use get component. In Godot, you use signals. So what signals do is that they transmit basically like a ping or like a function, if you will, that something has happened or that something has been set or something has been triggered, and that when that happens, allow for the next kind of step to happen, or allow for a Boolean to be triggered. And if that Boolean is then triggered, then we can activate something else in the scene. So it's a much more direct way of having different nodes communicate to one another that wouldn't be necessarily accessing the particular node and then like a script within the node or the different properties of that node. Instead, it's a much more directed way of sending data information or interactivity between different nodes in your game. So that should be something, so that'll be something that we're working on together. So like a practical, I misspelled this here, but a practical example of this is when you've intersected with a collider and you want to tell the colliding object that you can now interact, you'd use a signal. Number 6, and I think that this is like kind of the last main lesson that I would say, is that there's a big difference between the way that collision and triggers work in Unity and the way that they work within Godot. The way that they work within Godot is that you use what are called physics layers. So by default, the physics layers that we have set up right now between our plane and our player work just fine because they're working on simultaneously the same layer and the same mask. And we're going to talk about that in more detail in just a second. But if you want to have a different collision, or different objects collide with different things, or different things be able to be interactable with different things, I should say nodes, to be really specific here, you use what are called the physics layers, and that you have to set your objects to both exist on a layer. So what layer does the node collide with, right? And then what mask does that node then affect? Right? So we're going to look at practical examples of this, but I found that this can be somewhat confusing to remember, especially if you set your layers in like kind of a non-intuitive way, like I did when I was building my project. So you can actually see here, I set the default layer to be the player. So any new instance of an object in my game was automatically being able to be interacted with by the player. And that was like not a great way of designing it. But again, we're going to figure out ways of doing this together so that those collisions and those interactions, or those kind of what you would traditionally call triggers in Unity, behave in an expected way. Cool. Okay, so those are like, those kind of 6 points to me are, again, the kind of these main central points. And I'm going to actually kind of scroll back through these just really quickly. The difference between collision behaves much differently. Signals is how you would, is kind of equivalent to a get component, or how you will send information, or send kind of flags, if you will, to different nodes. 2D nodes, you would use 2D nodes to arrange your HUD and UI. There are ways in which you can kind of arrange these using some UI elements, but you wouldn't use a traditional canvas. Singletons are like scriptable objects, a way in which you can kind of create a script that holds data that is pervasive throughout all of your scenes. There are no components, there's only nodes, and everything is a prefab. Which is to say that you can, whatever scene that you create and whatever scene tree that you could create can be instanced in any other scene basically as much as you want. Okay, so let's jump back into Godot. Cool. Are there any questions before? I know that I ran through that really quickly. Again, I'm just trying to be mindful of time because I want to make sure that we're getting back into Godot and trying to get through the rest of the little bit of the lesson plan that I have here. But are there any questions about those kind of 6 key things? Sorry, I just hit my mic. I'm gonna let that sit for just 1 second. I'm trying to be, the diligent teacher here to allow anybody to ask any questions. But y'all have been really great in being able to ask questions when they come up, so I appreciate that very much. Cool. All right, so let's jump back into Godot, because what I want to do is that I want to start building out some of our little like walking sim thing that we did, or that we want to make by the end of today's workshop. Okay, so I'm going to go back to my demo main, and I'm going to click on 3D, and I'm going to start to use some of the scenery, some of the objects that hopefully that you've been able to download and bring into your project. Again, those, Lee, if you could do me a solid and repost that Unlearn Unity bit.ly/Unlearn Unity, that would be so fantastic. I really appreciate that. And again, Lee, thanks so much for being so helpful today too. This has been super great. Okay, so in Godot, I'm going to go where I have my demo objects loaded as my resource. And you'll see that I've loaded in a number of different 3D objects that are Collider DAE files, okay? Collida, I think I said that incorrectly. Collida, excuse me. These Godot prefers a couple of different file types. DAE, Collida, really likes that. It can take like raw OBJ files, though it doesn't do a great job of storing the material information for that. So that's kind of a bummer. And the other thing that it takes okay is GTLF files. which are, also kind of, they're kind of native, not native, I shouldn't say that, but they go nicely into Godot. I used DAE files, and you're going to see in 1 second why I did that. It's because some of these objects have loaded in them collision, because I wanted to just make that easier for everybody. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to start with my regular old tree. So I'm going to load in my resource folder, I'm going to find regular tree. I can either find it here or I can just search for it by searching regular tree or regular. And I'm going to double click on that. And what Godot is going to ask me is that it was automatically imported, which means that I dragged and dropped it into my scene or I put it into my folder. So it can't be directly modified. To make changes to it, you can create an inherited scene. Okay. So that's exactly what I want to do. I'm going to say new inherited. And what you'll find here is a not so little tree. Okay. And again, I got these assets from Kine. I'll post the link to this here. Kine.nl. Awesome resource. They are the best. And when I say they, I really just mean pretty much the one guy that runs Kine. He's amazing. Big fan. So what I did is that I created a new scene out of this imported object. And if you look back, or if you think back to the little slide presentation that I have here, what I have here is a spatial node that is the top level node of this tree. Of the scene tree, I should say. Apologies for any confusion. And then I have a mesh instance of the model. I have a collision node, a static body node for this, to mean that this is basically going to be a static thing. It's not going to be affected, or it's not going to be affected by gravity. And a collision shape, which basically is a concave mesh around this tree. Cool. And it also, by default, because I made this in Blender, it also loads in an animation player, but there's no data in the animation player. If I wanted to have this move around, I guess I could, but I don't need to load any animation. And unfortunately, we're not going to really get into looking at a lot of animation using Godot. But if you are familiar with animation software like Blender or like anything like that, I found it really, really intuitive. So again, nothing kind of too additional or major there. So I've loaded in this model as a scene, and I'm going to hit save, and I'm going to save this scene. And I probably want to save this I want to do a good kind of game dev job here, and I want to create a folder that's going to be a scenes folder so that I know exactly where this is going to be saved. And I'm going to save this just as called regular tree .tscn, which is a scene file for Godot. I'll hit save. And now what I will do is, if I go back to my demo main scene, I can now drag that scene into my Godot here, or my scene here, and it works like so. So that it's now loaded into Godot as an object. And you can certainly make this local if you want to, but because I loaded this in as a particular object, I'm just going to go ahead and press play. All right, I should be able to collide with it. So believe me, I'm hitting, y'all can't see this, so let me switch my OBS. I'm so sorry. Here we go. So I've loaded it in, and now I've collided with it. Cool. So what I'd like us to do is to spend maybe 10 minutes or so going through some of these assets. I'm going to hit escape and X out of that, then go back to here. And what I'd like us to do for the next 10 minutes so, and I can answer any questions that people might have, is that I want to just like try to like populate my scene here a little bit so that I have some of the objects that I've loaded in, and I'm going to load them in as scenes. So to answer the initial question, can anybody explain? Yeah, you can double click it in the file section. If you got a little bit behind how to get the DAA in the file system to a fresh scene, yeah, all you have to do is just double click it. So I'll do that again for this. I'll do it for this stone wall. I'll double click that and I'll click new inherited, right? And then I'm not going to change anything about this. I'm just going to hit save, and I'll save this as stone wall in that scene folder. Go back to my demo main, and I can, start bringing that in here. Oops. Oh, I want to be mindful of this, is that anytime that I drag this stone, if I just drag this into the scene like this, it will automatically be assigned to be a child of whatever I have highlighted already. So if you will want to avoid doing that, I just want to be cautious and make sure that I don't have anything selected in my scene, in my main kind of scene, unless it's main, the kind of main tree that I have here. So if I drag this in, right, I can drag it in this way too, if that's a better way, so that I can set it at the 0 point, right? I can move this around. I can start to rotate this. Cool. Just create a little, environment for myself. So it doesn't, just to clarify August's statement there, it doesn't automatically create one. We need to say that we want to create a new inherited scene, and then we want to make sure that we save it, right, as a scene that then will create that .tscn that we can then bring back into demo main. Cool. So I'll say stone wall. Cool. And I'll click and drag that into my main tree. Cool. So I'm going to just spend, 10, 20 minutes, or not that long, because we don't have that long, but maybe like 10 minutes, just kind of arranging some stuff here. And again, I'm staying on this kind of main select tool so that I can use like rotate and kind of move. If I wanted to change the scale here, I can hit the R key, or I can select that. If I wanted to make this like wider, I could hit the W key to, go to move, right? Cool, stuff like that. How would I learn to assign? Like, what would I be Googling? Yeah, that's a great question. So you could actually do something that's pretty similar to what we did before when we created our plane. So if you remember, when we selected our plane, we clicked on mesh and we said create tri-mesh static body, so that you could do that for your objects too. Yes, Captain Slip. Yes, you might have missed my slide presentation, but that is exactly what this is. Yes, so inherited scenes are kind of like Unity's prefabs. That's correct. So I'm just going to kind of continue to build out some of the stuff that I have here. What else do I want to? I'll maybe, import some grass. Save that. Grass, cool. And I like trying to close out the existing ones that I've already known that I've created in my scene, just because I find that it's can be like less distracting. I don't know, I'm that kind of person, I guess. Cool. Create some nice little grass here. Maybe I can even like rotate this a little bit so that it doesn't seem so uniform. Maybe I want to scale this a little bit. Oops, not that much. Scale it a little bit so that it's not as large as everything else. Cool. Right. I could certainly duplicate this by hitting Control D, right? And I can duplicate this, create more, as it were, instances of it. The other thing that I should say too, it's really easy to toggle between the global transforms and the local transforms of any spatial object that you have loaded in. If I hit T, that will actually toggle me between the object's current transforms, or I should say not the object, the node, the current transforms, and the global. If you're kind of curious to know where you are on this, if you kind of look up here in the 3D view this kind of a toggle here either says use local space or use kind of global space. So I'm going to go back to hit the Q key to get kind of my pointer back. I feel like this is a little bit too scaled up, so I'm just going to scale this down. Cool. And I'll try to rotate this so that it's, again, not so uniform. Just a nice little kind of game design tip to, you know, make things feel less on the grid. I can duplicate that. You know, move this over here. You know, rotate that a little bit more. Anyways, cool. So we can go ahead and, you know, spend a little bit more time doing this. Feel free to do this as much to your heart's content. But one thing that I definitely want everybody to load in here or to make an instance of, oh geez, did I not make that into an OBJ file? That's okay, we can use, I think I did it for the tent. Did I? Yeah, tent open, right? I wanna make sure that I'm loading in this tent. And we're gonna use this tent to be the thing that we will interact with, okay? Cool. So I'll save this, and I can just save that as tent open. And I'll just go ahead and load that in to my main tree here. That seems a little ridiculous for how big it is. So let's go ahead and scale that down. Right? Maybe I want to go back and scale these back up. Maybe these also need to be scaled. And again, I'm just kind of using the Q hotkey to get my pointer tool back, right? And then using R to scale, right? Q to select, and then R to scale. Cool. And then T, again, to toggle between world space and, right, local space, if I want to move those between those two axes. Q to select, D, can move this over, rotate this. Cool. And I'm just like, I don't know, just arranging a little vignette, right? A little kind of vignette space that has different objects loaded in here. Yeah, I don't know. Just a little kind of scene. Cool. So whenever we're ready, we're going to move on to the next step. I just wanted to give people a little bit of time to, you know, just get a little familiar with how you can instantiate those objects, both load them in, right, as scenes, and then instantiate them in your root node so that you can easily start to, you know, do some pretty quick prototyping. I mean, granted, we're using these assets that I am borrowing from Kine, but you know, really quickly we could start to create a situation where we can, yeah, have our character kind of walk around in the space. And I'll just play this really quickly and show everyone. Oops. Right, so I have the scene here, right? So I can collide with that tent. I can collide with this. Oh, geez. Oh, I think maybe some of the faces on this are a little bit backwards. So that might be what's causing a little bit of a collision issue. I noticed here that surface isn't, I maybe should have tested this a little bit more, but that's okay. You kind of get the picture, hopefully. Okay. Cool. Yeah. It's as easy as that. It's as easy as that, August. Yeah, we just made a little Animal Crossing. Cool. All right, so I think like the last main thing that I really want to do here is that I really would like to try to show y'all how signals works and to make a little gdscript together that shows like how these things interact with one another, or how different nodes can interact with one another. So I'm going to make sure to close out the scene. And what I'm going to do is that I'm going to create another node here. And I'm going to have that node be a child of my tent open, okay? And what I want this node to be is that I want this to be actually the thing that we're going to interact with, right? I want this to act as my trigger, right? As the thing that is going to trigger the, something to happen. Cool? So I'm going to add a node, and I'm going to add just I want to be mindful again. I'm going to select tent open, and I'm going to add a node here, and I'm going to add a collision shape to that node, and I'm going to click create, and I'm going to rename this as soon as I've made it tent interact, something like that. Cool. So now that I've made that, I need to assign what that shape is. So I'm going to create I think a sphere shape is good for us. Okay. Oh, and I realized that I kind of did this in a little bit of a backwards order. That's totally okay. So what I'm going to do is that it's fine that I have that collision shape that I made, but I'm going to add another node here to my tent open. So I'm going to click add node, and I'm going to search for area. Okay, and you'll see that there's collision object area, and I'll go ahead and click create, and you'll notice that you have these two little kind of errors, right, that we had before, these two little kind of warnings that that were provided to us early on when we were kind of putting these together. And what I'm going to do is that I'm going to select my tent interact and make that a child of my area node, and you'll notice that then those kind of go away. So I have my area node here. This all looks good to me. I'm going to get into how the collision here works. If I go to my tent interact, I'm going to increase the sphere of this, right? So that might be hard to see on the stream. I'm going to kind of reposition the camera a little bit so that you can see it. So that if I click on this kind of red circle here, I'm going to just increase basically the diameter of my sphere, so that when I'm kind of within the bounds of this thing, or within the extents, I should say, I think that that's a proper term for collision, either or, I guess, that, I can collide with this, pretty easily. Cool. When we add those nodes to a TSN object in scene, is it the same as loading up the particular TSN? No, that's a great question. No, it's not. So this tent open, right? If I click on, actually, I'm going to do that one more time. If I click where it says tent open, right? And you can actually see there's like that little clapper sign. That actually opens up the initial node, right? The initial node that we created that scene for, right? So this is, again, how the architecture of Unity is, or excuse me, I keep doing that. The architecture of Godot is really unique, right? So think of this tent open as a singular instance of this area node being attached to it and this tent interact, okay? So not all instances of that tent open scene file are going to have these areas attached to them. So where I'm attaching them in this main tree here is really important, right? So I don't want this to be attached to the kind of the scene that I created when I imported this object. I want it to be attached to in this kind of main scene. Does that answer your question? Apocalyptopus. Very proud of myself for being able to say that. I hope so. Cool. So yeah. Yeah. So so hopefully August, right? This is clicking for a lot of people, right? Is that when I've created this instance of this scene, right? I could create many, many instances of this object, right? But I'm now extending, if you will, or like adding additional, what would be considered components, right? Or extending the functionality and behavior of this scene node, right? So because I know that this node already has like collision attached to it, I don't want to use the default collision of when I made, right, this scene. I want to use additional collision that I have on top of that. Yeah, so you have it added to the instance of the tent open scene in the hierarchy. Cool. Okay. But if I did want to have it identical area, I could add it to the original scene and it reflected, right? Yes, you could. You could. The only thing that I would worry about that is that I don't want your different collision shapes to be. Yeah, I guess it would be okay. Again, I would just make sure that you're adding it to tent open node and not to the mesh instance. Okay, to avoid any confusion with collision. Cool. Sorry about the background noise. Someone is like revving their bike in the background. Okay, so I have this tent here, and what I want to do is that I want to both set up the physics of how this is going to work, and I want to have this so that when my physics is, when I'm kind of, if you will, colliding with this interaction here, right, that will send a signal to something else. And again, for the sake of time, I might kind of simplify this a little bit. But hopefully we can work on this all together. So I'm going to add well, let's start with our collision. Sorry, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. Let's start with our collision. So I'm going to go to Project Settings, and I'm going to go to the General tab. And this is something, again, that I found that was like not super intuitive within Godot. So I'm happy to go over this with us together. And I'm going to search for the 3D physics, or if I just type in 3D, you'll actually see layer names pop up, and I want 3D physics. Okay. I'm going to hit I'm going to get out of that so that I still have 3D physics selected, right? And I'm going to rename my layers here, okay? So layer 1, I'm going to have named, and again, this might seem somewhat counterintuitive, but we're going to follow these processes together. I'm going to enable that to be environment. Okay? And I'm going to name my layer 2 to be player. Okay? So again, you're going to want to search for layer names, 3D physics, and you're going to have environment and player. Cool. I think I would say, to answer your question, I think I would call them instanced scenes. Do we call these objects in the scene scenes? I'm just answering that question. Yeah, so I would say, yeah, sure, you could do how do Godot scenes work, or what I would search for is like how do you instance Godot scenes, something like that, or how do you load scenes or work with scenes as nodes? Maybe is the correct way that I would say that. Okay, so I have layer 1 and layer 2 loaded in here. I'm going to go ahead, that automatically saves, and I'm going to hit close. And what I'm going to do before doing anything else is that I'm going to check and see how this is behaving. So let's go ahead and press play with the clapboard. And so we're behaving the way that we want, but what I am noticing is that once I have that sphere, I'm able to, walk, I think, up and over my tent because of that sphere, right? Oh, and y'all, I'm so sorry. Hold on. Here we go. Right? You might have been able to walk up and over your tent from before, but, right? So basically now what I'm doing is that I'm actually colliding with that sphere. And what I want to do is that I don't want to collide with it. I want that sphere to operate as kind of an interaction, okay? So I'll hit escape, get out of there. And what I'm going to do is that I'm going to make sure, yeah, let's just make sure that this, I'm going to kind of exaggerate this a little bit to just really see that this is behaving in the way that I expect it to. So right now, it looks like the way this is working is that it actually is working the way that I want it to, which is allowing me to walk through the right interaction, which is okay. So the reason for that is in my layer and in my mask here, right, my collision is not set to basically interacting with this FPS player the way that I want to. So what I'm going to do is that, just for the purposes of understanding this, is that I'm going to go to my FPS player and I'm going to look at my collision in the physics body kind of properties of my kinetic body first person FPS player node. And I'm going to set this mask to be on this kind of second little square here. And I'm going to turn off the first square, okay? And I want to see what that does, okay? I want to experiment and see what that does. So I'm going to click play, and my guess is what's going to happen is that I'm going to sync through something, maybe? No? That's interesting. So what I was actually hoping was going to happen, let's see. Let's put this. Let's put them both on the second one. I'm so sorry. Let's put this both on the second one. Because what's going to happen is that now I'm going to sync through the floor. Now, I'm going to restart that again so that you can see it. So what this is doing is that I have, right, set my player to be on the second layer, right? So what that means, I'm going to try to turn this off so that it's not annoying us. What this means is that we can't see your inspector. Oh, you think I'm zoomed in? Hold on, let me just realign that really quickly. So sorry about that. Sorry, I'm so sorry, everybody. I'm so sorry. I think what happened, yeah, is that when I switched it to the, here, let me just make sure that that's, this is gonna look a little bit funky for 1 second, but just bear with me. I'll transform, fit to screen. Okay, so hopefully, I'll redo it right now. That sounds great. So, can everybody see? No, hold on. Display capture. Here we go. Here we go. Sorry. Fit to screen. There we go. So everybody should now be able to see my inspector over here. Sorry, the reason why I switched it is because Godot loads a new window and I wanted you all to be able to see, right, the scene, right? Okay. So what I had done in my FPS player is that I have it selected here and I have layer, right? I have in my physics body here, I have my layer in my collision set to the second block here, which is the player block, as opposed to the first layer, which is the environment block. So the reason why I set this is because I wanted to show everybody that this is how collision works. So my player here, right? My player here is colliding with, right, my environment layer. And all of the objects that I have here, if I load these scenes, all of the collision, right? Where are they? Here it is. All of the collision is by default on environment, right? So that's the default layer, okay? So if I want to then have this sphere interact with my player, right? I could set the mask of this to be on player and have my tent interact, right, also be, well, because it's not a collision shape and it's just, it's not a static collision, it's an area collision, this is going to be a little bit funky going forward, but I know that I want the mask of this, right, to be affecting my player, okay? So I want it to be working on the player mask, okay? So what I can do is that I could set my, oops, I think that Godot kind of hung up there for just a split second. Sometimes this happens. I hope this didn't crash too much. There we go. I'm back. I'm going to make sure to save this so that I don't lose anything. File, save scene. Okay. Save. Okay. So I want this player, right? I'm going to make it so that the layer that it exists on is both environment and that player mask, so that anything that this interacts with, right, will be able to send a signal to. Now, if I turn this onto the player layer, it will sync through the ground, right? It won't actually, well, actually it might just hover where it is because it's attached here. So I'm going to set this interactive area thing here, right, to be, you know, being able to understand that when this object, this player object, right, is passing through it for me to be able to do some kind of interesting and fun stuff. Cool. So now I'm on this, I'm able to interact with it, or I mean, for lack of a better term, I can interact with it, right? And we're going to send a signal that says that this interaction has happened, okay? So let's do that together. Cool. I'm going to kind of disable this thing really quickly so that I can just see. Cool. You can see in the window. Okay, cool. Okay, I think we're all cut up. Great. All right. So in my tent, in my area, what I'm going to do is that I'm going to right click and I'm going to say attach script. Okay. And it's going to ask me what kind of script that I want to attach and the path in my resource folder for where that's going to be, you know, saved. So I'm going to click this folder here and I'm going to do, again, my due diligence as a game developer, and I'm going to create a new folder called scripts, and I'm going to save that script, and I'm going to save this as tent. Oh, will it allow me to change this here, please? Yes. Oops. Tent interact. Okay, so now it says the path is in my scripts folder and the file is called tent interact. And when I create that script, it will now create a new demo script or a new kind of default script that I can use, right, in Godot or using Godot scripting. Gwen, if you still fall through the floor, you want to make sure that on your FPS player that you have the layer in your collision set to be environment and player. Okay. Okay, cool. Excellent. Okay, so in my script here, what I want to do is that I basically want to do, I want to set up a signal, okay? And I'm going to use actually a default signal within this area node. And I could see what the default signal is if I select my area node, okay, in my tree here, and I select node. You could see in this kind of signals tab, there's area shape entered, and area shaped exited, and a number of different default kind of signals that we can send. But what we're going to do is that I'm going to say, I want to use this body entered, okay? And I'm going to connect this body entered signal to send a signal, okay? So when I click on this, if I double click on this, it's going to ask me what script I want this a signal to be attached to as a method. And you'll notice that I can only attach this to two things. I can either attach this to FPS player, or I can attach this to my area node, right? And my area node, right, has a script attached to it that we just made. So I'm going to create a method of this signal in my area node. So this is going to be this on body entered. So I'm going to say connect. So what that did is that it created a brand new function for me that operates as a signal, right, sending information, okay? Now, it's sending information right now to itself, okay? It's sending a signal to itself that then what I'm going to do is that basically I'm going to kind of build on top of this signal to send a signal to my player, right? That's going to then display something. And this seems a little bit wacky, but I'm trying to walk through this in, again, a somewhat condensed way, just because I feel like I'm running a little bit over time. And for those that are wondering, I'm actually aiming for kind of a 5:30 cutoff. Unfortunately, I have some family obligations to make sure that I'm attending to. So so apologize if this last section seems like a little bit quick, but hopefully we're going to get through this section together. So I've loaded in the signal, this default signal as a method within the script that I just made. And what I'm going to do is that I'm going to create a custom signal that I'm going to send to my player. So the way that I do that is that I'm going to create a variable, and I'm going to get rid of these comments here, right? I actually don't need these things, and I actually don't even need this ready as well. So I can get rid of that, and I can get rid of this process as well, so that I'm really just left with this on area body entered. Okay? And what I'm going to do is that I'm going to create a signal, okay? And I'm going to call that signal, let's just call it can interact. Oops, I don't need a semicolon at the end. Cool. And so what you could think of the signal as a variable, right? That then I can access in my areas, right? My area node here, right? That then can connect to a separate thing. Cool. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to go back to my 3D, my script here. And I'm going to say that when I've entered this body, or when I've entered this area, I'm going to emit signal, and I'm going to call that can interact. Okay? And luckily for us, we have some nice IntelliSense autocomplete within gdscript. So I'm emitting the signal can interact. Cool. And again, think of the signal like a Git component, or think of the signal as something that's raising a flag or telling something else in our scene that you can do something. Cool. So I'm going to attach that can interact signal to my player. All right. And I'm going to then have that player kind of print something to the console. Cool. So if I select my area, and you'll see actually now I have this little signal icon attached to this because I'm using the signal already, which is great. So I'm going to select can interact in the signals in my node. and I'm going to click connect. And I'm going to connect that to my FPS player. And I could rename this method if I want to. I like kind of keeping the conventions. I don't know why I like doing that. I think I just learned to do it that way. But I like this on area can interact. That seems fine to me. Or maybe I could rename this to like on tent collide, can interact. If I want to be a little bit more specific, but the default seems fine to me. So I'm going to click connect. And what you'll notice is that this is going to create a new function within my player.gd script. So I'm going to click connect. And it created a new function here that says on tent collide can interact, right? And I have this pass here, but what I'm going to do is that I'm going to create really, really quickly at the top here, I'm going to say onReady var, which stands for variable, bool, which is a Boolean, just a true or false statement. And I'm going to just name that can interact. Or I'll say like interact _ ready. I think that's a better understanding. And I'm going to say that this is false. Cool. I don't know why that's be Boolean. Oh, does it need to be Boolean? Oh, I'm so caught up in C#. I actually don't need to declare what the variable type is here. I'm so sorry. I don't know why that was causing me such hangups. I just need to say that this is like something so unique and like different from gdscript to C#. And I'm so sorry that I don't have a ton of time to get into this. But I don't need to declare the data type here. gdscript is very similar to Python in that it automatically parses the type depending on how I'm claiming the value here. So that the signal function is now at the bottom of this script. So it says function on tent collide can't interact. And now what I'm going to say for this is, what was the name of the variable that I just made? Interact ready. I'm going to say interact ready is now true. Okay? And so what I'm going to do is that in a function that's up here that's called process delta, which you could kind of think about this as like an update function. I'm going to say if interact ready, and then colon, which is how gdscript handles kind of the types of logic that we would be used to using in a different kind of programming environment. If interact ready, I'm going to say print, and I'm going to say you can interact. Yes, the way to connect this, and I'm going to make sure to save both of these, the way to connect this is, again, if I click on the area node in my hierarchy, over here in the inspector, there's a node tab here, and because I created my custom can interact signal, right, in the tent interact script, right, I attach that then to, if I double click on that, it will load that function here. Cool. Hopefully that clarified and answered that question. So let's go ahead and see if this prints to the console. Again, I'm going to kind of switch my thing here. I'm going to go ahead and press play. Okay. And you'll notice that I get, you can actually see my little scroll bar at the bottom down here is just like making can interact over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. So we want to, create the opposite of this, right? Where we want to say intent interact when we exit that body, that then it emits a signal, a different signal, right, that sets that to be false, right, that intent interact to be false. So let's repeat that process again, kind of doing the inverse. So we'll make a new signal, cannot interact. And again, I know this seems like a little bit bloated or a little bit kind of clumsy for the way that we're making this, but it's just to kind of show you the power of how signals and kind of getting things to send data to different scripts kind of works. And the first thing that I want to do is have my on body exited node. I want to connect that to the script that I have here. And I want to emit signal and then cannot interact. Okay. And then select my area, and now I'm going to connect the signal of cannot interact to my FPS player. And on that FPS player, that connect interact will say interact ready is false. So then it won't continue to print that statement here that I have, right, of can interact. Cool. So I'm gonna switch back over to this so that in case anybody is having any difficulty connecting these things, or maybe I'll just show how this works. Right, so I'll print the statement, and then as soon as I walk out of it, right, it no longer is printing all of those statements, right? It's no longer populating, right, my output here, the kind of kernel that I have here to print those statements. And then again, if I interact with it, right, it'll start to print those statements. And then if I move out of the boundaries of that kind of bubble, right, that it does that, right? It prevents me from doing that. Really quickly, while I'm here, some of you might be wondering, like, how can I see kind of some of the stuff happening in real time, like in the editor? If you go over to your scene mode, or excuse me, if you go over to your scene in Godot while your game is playing, right, while it's currently playing, and hit remote, you could see, right, how these things, right, might be looking. Now you won't be able to see like these things quite moving. I think it's kind of difficult to see how these things are moving. Yeah, it won't show you how they're moving in real time, right? But at the very least, you'll be able to see how these things are behaving or interacting with each other to see if they are indeed, colliding in the intended way. So this can also be a really helpful way of seeing how the actual tree of your scene is being loaded in your game to make sure that all of the behaviors of your objects, or the behaviors of your nodes, I should say, are interacting in accordance with one another. Cool. So again, sorry, I'm just going to switch back over to make sure that I can see anything in the chat. Cool. So I'm going to try to reinforce a couple of points that I have here and unfortunately wrap up a little bit. But what I want to kind of reiterate here is that in Godot, right, the way that these signals work is that they're sending data and information, right, either to kind of the node itself, right, in the instance of tent interact, right, or sending it to, right, another, right, node in the case of this emit signal. Now you might be wondering, right, what I could do here is that let's say I could kind of configure this ever so slightly, and I could disconnect all, right? I could disconnect all of these signals, right? And I could disconnect, right? And then I could get rid of these, right? These different signals. Oops. Disconnect these, right? And I could kind of remove these signals here if I wanted to. And I could say when this body has been entered, just connect that directly to the FPS player, and have this interact ready be set to true. And similarly, to set, right, my body exited to the FPS player to be interact ready equal to false, right? So I wanted to show kind of the two ways in which you can kind of modify these different signals. Obviously, I don't have any need for these on these other signals that I have here because I'm no longer sending them right out here. So that could be, potentially more direct way of sending these signals, right? And again, works and behaves the same way. I kind of did it oops, I realized, so sorry everybody. I realize that I kind of did it the long way the first time, but it was in an effort to show you the different ways in which signals can either be self-referencing, right? Reference some behavior that you want to program within the script itself, or it can then send a direct signal to a completely different node in your scene, right? So as long as that behavior works the way that it's intended, right, it now, will print that statement. And again, to reinforce this point, here I'll kind of close this. To reinforce this point, the reason why this works is because the collision of this area node, right, is on both the player layer and the player mask, and our FPS player is the only thing that's on our player layer, right? So that's why it's interacting there, as opposed to printing the statement just all the time. Okay? Cool. So I'm going to switch back over here. Sorry, let me just get rid of this display and see these questions here. It seems to be triggering regardless of player position. So the reason for that is cannot interact. Oh, so that might be one reason. The other reason is Zoizone. The other reason why that might be is that you need to make sure that the signals, or excuse me, let me be specific. Sorry, I'm getting a little bit tongue-tied at the end of this lesson here. You need to make sure that the collision, right, is behaving in the right way, right? So the area node, right, that's sending your signals, right, the thing that knows that it's looking for the player is this mask, right? And because the mask is set to this physics layer of this kind of what we had set before as the player, right, going back to our project settings, right, layer 2 is set to player, right, or that's the name of it at least, right, because we have it interacting with only objects, or only nodes, I should say, that are on the, right, player layer, right, that's why that signal is being sent, right? All of the other objects that we have, right, if I look through and look at each one of the, right, collision of this, all of these are set to be on the environment layer, right? So that's why that signal is only, or that might be why your signal is sending all the time, right? Because you need to make sure that whatever object that you want to be colliding with is masked to the correct layer that you want it to interact with. Cool? And that again, whatever node that you want to have interact with that is also set to that correct layer. Hopefully, Zoizone, that clarifies that point. Cool. Awesome. Okay, so again, I feel a little bit bad that I've kind of truncated a lot of this stuff, and we didn't really get into a lot of the ways in which gdscript is really unique from C#. that wasn't quite the full intention of what I wanted to get to today, and I apologize if I kind of breeze through some of the scripting stuff here. I'm more than happy to answer any questions about how to get started with some of the scripting stuff and how to incorporate some scripting, learning gdscript into your own projects. I realize that the thing that kind of like is the most scripting intensive thing that we've gone over today, is the thing that I just kind of handed to you. And so, some of you might be a little bit, frustrated that we didn't look at that more. But in a gesture of good faith, my presentation is not entirely done. If you look at the very last slide, or the second to last slide in this presentation, you can actually see that I've listed here some resources for you. The Godot docs, as always, which is the main Godot documentation, is I find sometimes helpful. I find that it's not as helpful as the Unity documentation because it doesn't list a lot of pragmatic use cases for a lot of things. But one of the things that I found is the most helpful is the Kids Can Code YouTube channel. Kids Can Code is just so good. Let me see if I could find it really quickly. Kids Can Code. Here they are. I think that's just like a bunch of their playlists. But they have a specific kind of course that walks through getting started in Godot, learning Godot scripting, gdscripting in particular. And this controller that I've built is almost identical to the controller that they make. So I should give proper credit to say that, if it wasn't for Kids Can Code, I wouldn't be able to have done the node tree that we did together. GDQuest is another good resource for looking at different kind of more specialized topics, I would say. Specialized topics. I'm going to post this link in the chat. For looking at Godot, they have a whole section or a whole an update right now that's about cool things that are in Godot 3.4, which is really exciting. Emilio, which is another YouTube personality. I'm not going to go through and link through all of these. I would encourage you to check them out. Heartbeast, I've heard, is really ineffective or really great. Also YouTube channel that focuses on Godot content. I haven't used any of their tutorials. They're pretty specialized, I would say. I do know that they have made like a beginner thing, or that he's made a beginner thing. I haven't really gone through it, but I also linked to this Godot. I'll see if that actually comes up here. This /r/Godot resource that's a list of video and written tutorials that is pretty comprehensive. A lot of these are from users in the R Godot channel. There's a lot of folks in there. There's a lot of great stuff in here. People reference Kids Can Code, right? Godot recipes, right? That's like up there for sure. A really helpful resource. So I would also highly encourage you to check that out. Cool. The last slide that I have here, and again, I apologize that I'm like kind of running up to the end here, is just like a huge thank you. I wish that I could spend like a whole nother like hour and a half talking with y'all about the differences, but I really hope that in walking through some of the examples and walking through this kind of slide presentation of what I found to be the biggest hurdles of translating knowledge between Unity and Godot were outlined. Godot I find to be, August, like really clean, the architecture to be super simplified, really refined. I've really come around to understanding the logic of how it's put together and why it's built in this kind of node-based structure. And just to reinforce that point, the rationale and reasoning for that is to really make for fast, easy, prototypable, quick to assemble, quick to generate, easily instantiatable, content and games that aren't kind of bogged down and bloated and needing to have like a lot of intense under the hood knowledge. So that's like definitely a huge takeaway that I hope people get away from this little lesson that I put together for everybody. Cool. So Again, thanks so much. I really appreciate it. Thanks to Lee. Thanks to everybody at Babycastles. Thanks to all of you for coming and attending. I really appreciate it. I appreciate so much of the questions, the feedback. Y'all have been a really great group. If anybody has any questions or follow-up things for me, please feel free to reach out to me on Twitter. My handle is right there, or was right there. It's just SA Games. And you can find a bunch of my other stuff there, so please feel free to check that out. Cool. Thanks, everybody. Be well, be safe, enjoy Godot, say bye to Unity, and can't wait to see all the cool projects that you are coming up, or that you're going to be working on in Godot going forward. Yeah, thanks, Babycastles. If you aren't already, I would highly recommend joining the Babycastles Discord. It's a great community, amazing group of people. They have amazing Academy lessons like this. They're just, to me, just the total jam. And I can't thank them enough. Okay, cool. That's it. Goodbye. Thanks, everybody. Take care. Be well. Bye.